Well, welcome everybody to this installment of SES's webinar series, Food and Agriculture Rising. My name is Brandon Nauman. I'm going to be your presenter today. We've got quite a bit of material to get through here, and the first few slides just kind of set the stage for everything to come. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here right on time. Really, during this webinar series, we're looking at harnessing the power of independent verifications for food brands, for producers to reach out to their consumers and to really communicate the efforts that they're making to deliver a quality product. Today's topic specifically is looking at an approach to cleaner food and agriculture, really multiple approaches to cleaner food and agriculture, reducing pesticides and improving food quality. So before we get started, I just want to let everyone know that you all are in listen only mode, meaning hopefully you can all hear me, but I cannot hear you. Towards the end of the presentation, about 15 minutes till the top of the hour, we'll have a Q&A session. And anyone that has questions, I just encourage you to put them in the questions box or the chat box. Really, if you see in your dashboard, there is a space for questions, there is a space for chat. I will be monitoring both for questions, and we'll try to get to everyone's question at the end of the presentation. If I don't have time to get through everything, I'll follow up with anyone whose questions remain unanswered via email to make sure that we reach back out to you and that any questions you have are answered. And then finally, this webinar today is being recorded. We will be emailing everyone the webinar recording tomorrow. So thanks again, everybody, for attending this morning. Without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and start moving through our slides today. So my name is Brandon. I'm the technical director of the organic program here at SCS Global Services. Been with the company for 11 years, and I'm the grandson of an organic apple farmer, actually. So my upbringing was on farm. As a young adult, I was managing our apple orchards, managing our harvest, our sale of our crop. And then from there, found my way into the industry through consulting, helping a lot of our neighboring farms become certified organic. And eventually found my way into SCS Global Services, into our pesticide testing program. And then over the years came to manage our organic program, and I'm now our technical director. So something I'm very passionate about and can't wait to share some of this knowledge and what we've learned with you all today. So our webinar series is really focused on strong product standards, the importance of independent verification, and some proven winners for programs of how you can differentiate your products to reach out and to connect with your consumers and really communicate the good that you as producers are doing, you as manufacturers or growers are doing. So a couple of upcoming webinars that we have just over the horizon here, one on June 15th, focusing on on-product claims, non-GMO project, USDA organic and gluten-free. And then this August, we're looking at responsible and sustainable sourcing programs, formalizing your supplier expectations to raise the bar and provide transparency. So before we go too much further, I just want to provide a little bit of background on SCS Global Services, who we are. For those of you that don't know, we really do operate globally. We have more than 200 experts, auditors, staff around the globe across 23 subsidiaries, regional representatives, and sales offices. So there is not a continent, there's not an inhabited continent that SCS is not represented on. We really do have a truly global reach. Over the years, 38 plus years of experience running on close to 4 decades. We've issued over 30,000 certificates to 24,000 different clients. And we have auditors and representatives, as you saw, in all major markets. And as you'll see here shortly, there's really not a segment of sustainability and environmental claims and certifications that we are not involved in. And this is just a sampling of our food and agriculture services, both certification services, training for food safety, consulting for food safety, all of your GFSI level food safety audits, food labeling programs that you all will know, USDA Organic, SCS Gluten-Free, Non-GMO Project, SCS Pesticide Residue Free is a proprietary standard that actually our company was founded on over 3 decades ago. And so it goes into sustainable agriculture and so forth. So today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on cleaner food and agriculture practices. And what that means is ways that we can be reducing pesticides, reducing chemical fertility inputs, all while not only maintaining but improving the quality of the food that is delivered. And really it comes down to how modern agriculture is grappling with some of the challenges and the hard lessons that the past century has brought. So we'll really be getting into how this so-called idea of conventional agriculture really has kind of become so unconventional, and the impacts that that's having on our climate, on our ecosystems, and frankly on our health. And in line with the theme of our webinar series, we'll be exploring how independent third-party verifications are addressing these problems and literally are changing the planet. So forgive me if this is a lot of print here. I know that this is some small text, but just I wanted to start by giving kind of a brief timeline of agrochemical use over the last, well, 4,000 years, really. And some of the first examples of using agrochemicals, as they're now called, dates back to 2500 BC, when the Sumerians were using sulfur compounds to control insects and mites. And then, as you see, in ancient times, it was not uncommon to be using various plant derivatives. Chrysanthemum powder dates back to over 1000 BC when it was being used in China and in Persia. 1250 AD, arsenic was discovered, which really became one of the most important forms of pest control during kind of the Middle Ages and up until, you know, kind of the advent of modern agriculture. Calcium nitrate was synthesized in 1903, which was really a game changer for the agrochemical industry. It really was one of the discoveries that kind of gave birth to the agrochemical industry as we know it. Across the world wars, of course, we all know about chlorine gas and nerve agents and all these revolutionary synthetic chemicals that were derived as weapons of war that really found their way into our agrochemical systems. And then 1939 kind of rings in the start of the pesticide era with the discovery of DDT and its insecticidal properties as kind of this, well, at the time, what they thought was kind of this miracle compound that was going to solve all of our problems in agriculture. And then looking at, you know, kind of more modern times, the industrialized agriculture era. During the early 1900s, really pest control was largely done with some pretty heavy stuff, pretty nasty stuff, byproducts of heavy industry, creosote, naphthalene, petroleum oils, things like that. And then through the Dust Bowl, you know, tillage practices led to really the elimination of so much topsoil that in the 1930s, it was the Tennessee Valley Authority. They really got together, developed this fertilizer program to help nourish a lot of the soils in the middle part of the country back to life. And then kind of fast forward across the decades, you know, of course, the popularization of DDT in the 40s and the 50s led to kind of this awareness as we started to find some of the adverse health effects associated with some of these byproducts of heavy industry, with synthesized, DDT and heavy insecticides, is we were starting to see problems, with the indiscriminate use of these materials. And a lot of that was highlighted in the landmark book Silent Spring in 1962. Through the 70s, we really started to come to better understand some of the adverse effects of some of these chemicals that we were using, leading to the bans of DDT, aldrin, dieldrin, chlordane, and other substances here in the United States. And then on through the 70s, the introduction of Roundup really was a game changer for pesticides in the home, but also for the way in which we used herbicides in agriculture. It became not only a way to eliminate weed pests, but also to desiccate crops, to make harvest more efficient. And so that's why we're seeing actually so much persistence of Roundup residues in grain crops and breads and cereals and things like that, is because it literally was introduced into the marketplace as this supposedly safer alternative to the compounds that had been previously used, but it has become so pervasive that, as we now understand, that it's leading to many problems of its own. 1984, SCS Global Services introduced a novel program. It was the first of its kind, called NutriClean, and that was testing products, certifying them to the absence of any residues of pesticides down to the analytical limits of detection. So this really was a revolutionary program that predated even the organic industry, that really was getting at consumer avoidance of pesticides and providing a pathway for that. And then through the 2000s, what we're seeing is over 90% of our corn, our cotton, our soy acreage has actually been treated with herbicides, stuff like Roundup. That's how kind of pervasive this stuff has become. And then to kind of the modern era, 2022, we'll see as we go through the deck today, some modern production systems, indoor ag, vertical agriculture, really is starting to now have this emergence to kind of shake up the agriculture industry and the production practices that we've seen in place for, well, a century or more. So looking at the emergence or the normalization, I guess, of pesticides in the home, really through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we saw an explosion of so many different kinds of pesticides, so many different classes of pesticides introduced into the market. And many of these have not only been, targeting commercial, industrialized agriculture, but they're selling many of those same products that were designed for commercial agriculture. Some of these are neurotoxins. I mean, we're talking about carcinogens and nerve agents that the pesticide companies have really found that they can market these products for home use. So what you see here are a lot of labels that many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with. Many of you may even have in your home, but might not be aware of what the active ingredients in these things are and what the adverse effects of use of some of these products can actually be. You're looking at endocrine disruptors. You're looking at compounds that are highly acutely toxic, carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, pesticides that are really highly toxic to bees and fish. And in fact, what you can see here on the screen is so many of these compounds that you can go to Home Depot, you can go to Lowe's right now and you can buy this stuff. Half of these compounds are actually even banned in the EU, and many of them are banned in the rest of the world. So what we'll see as we kind of have this discussion today is how far behind the US can lag in some ways other countries and kind of getting behind regulation of pesticides. So again, this has become normal to be applying pesticides in your home. And it really is packaged by the pesticide companies as a requirement for home safety. You can hardly watch a 30-minute show without seeing an advertisement or two for a pesticide company. And, you know, this is stuff that's being targeted to parents for home use. And in that regard, Raid is taking it even one step further right now. These are some screen grabs from a commercial I saw night before last on TV, and it's their Protection for Everyone campaign. And they, you know, show children and they actually frame them in the Raid logo saying, this is a product that you must use to protect your children. This is a component of responsible parenting. The product that you actually see in the ungloved hand there in the red can is a compound that is, it's Raid's ant spray. And what it contains is cypermethrin and imipropyl. Both of those are pyrethroid insecticides. This particular spray comes in a couple of different nice flavors, or I guess they're fragrances, lavender and pine forest. But what they're not telling you is that pyrethroids really aren't necessarily these safe compounds that they were once thought to be. Cypermethrin specifically adversely affects the central nervous system. It's been linked to seizures, loss of motor control, and in cases of ingestion, actually death. It causes liver damage, is a possible carcinogen, and again, it can actually be easily fatal if ingested. So this is what's being marketed as a critical component of responsible home ownership, responsible parenting. Protect your children, protect your home from those ants, and use these products. The bottom line is that pesticides are made to kill. They would not be effective if they weren't. You know, many of these have origins in warfare as neurotoxins. Pesticides have been known to decimate beneficial predator and pollinator populations. They pollute soil and waterways. We'll discuss today how they contribute to climate change. But before we go on, you know, really all of this begs the question, how are pesticides regulated anyways? How is it that there can be such a difference in regulations from one place to the next, and how these kinds of compounds can end up in your home? So in the United States, pesticides are regulated by the EPA under the enforcement jurisdiction granted by the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Every compound, every pesticide and commodity combination are subject to maximum residue levels. So basically this establishes acceptable levels for these compounds to be found on food for consumers here. So this is just one example here. The pesticide is called propiconazole, and the commodity I chose here is tomatoes, just to identify how widely what one country says is safe relative to what another country says is safe or is an acceptable limit of this pesticide to be on your food. So what you see for tomatoes and propiconazole is that the United States, Canada, and China all say that it's fine to have 3 parts per million here on your tomatoes. Brazil backs that down to 0.1 part per million. Japan, even more restrictive, 0.05 parts per million on down to the European Union, which is 0.01, which is basically the analytical limits of detection. So what we say is acceptable here does not necessarily translate to what they say is acceptable in the European Union, for example. And really driving home that point is this graph right here. And what this shows is how many pesticides that are in use in the United States are either already banned or being phased out in the European Union, or in Brazil, or in China, or in 2 of the 3, or in all 3, as a matter of fact. So every single year in the US, over 1 billion pounds of pesticides that are banned elsewhere are applied here to American crops on American soil. So it does just really kind of exemplify where we are relative to the EU and some parts of the rest of the world. So why is this? Well, in the United States, one of the contributing reasons is that we allow the pesticide industry to fund their own studies, and basically they submit their own data demonstrating that use of their pesticides, of their products, will not generally cause what they call unreasonable adverse health effects on the environment. This stands in pretty stark contrast to the European Union, where in general, there's a prohibition against mutagens, carcinogens, reproductive toxins, endocrine disruptors. And as opposed to here in the US, the burden of proof is actually on the pesticide industry to demonstrate that there are no adverse effects on human or animal health. So as, again, in contrast to the United States, really here it's up to the pesticide companies just to put their own data out there to support how the use of this product can be done safely, where in the EU it's assumed that it cannot be done safely until they go out and prove that it absolutely can. And again, the universal prohibition on these different categories of toxins here really do limit the availability of some of the more highly toxic and highly hazardous compounds in Europe. So just to quickly look at some of the global trends in pesticide use, I know that this might be a little bit small on your screens. It's nothing too groundbreaking or difficult to understand here. From 1990 here on the left to 2017 here on the right, what you are seeing really globally is a trend to be using more pesticides. And you see that the likes of the United States, the likes of Brazil, especially in parts of Europe, really have kind of been on the forefront in that increase in pesticide use, China as well. And really that is to exemplify that this is not just a domestic problem, not just a, international problem, it really is a global issue. So we all know how carbon emissions, for example, really drive climate change, how industry, really drives climate change here. But I think fewer of us are really well aware of the pesticide climate connection here. And really what it comes down to is these very fragile, very complex soil ecosystems which sequester so much of the Earth's CO2. So our healthy soils are full of these invertebrate populations that are critical to soil health, crop quality, and the land's ability to sequester carbon. And in the United States, the EPA doesn't include these soil organisms in its pesticide risk assessments, despite studies that have unequivocally demonstrated that pesticide use leads to what? Pesticides in the soil. And that, of course, leads to the devastation of these invertebrate populations. So the EPA is not taking those organisms into account for pesticide risk assessments. Instead, what they look at to extrapolate a pesticide's impact to invertebrate populations in general is one single species, the honeybee, an organism that more than likely is going to actually live its entire life without ever touching soil. So this is just a glimpse at how the US regulatory system is set up to more protect the pesticide industry instead of the ecosystems and the environment that the Environmental Protection Agency was supposedly established to protect. And there you go, yes, they openly admit that between 50% and 100% of all agriculturally applied pesticides end up, guess where? In our soil. So this really just shows how important saving these soil ecosystems is, and that it will require reducing our reliance on pesticide-intensive agriculture to do so. So what about fertilizers? Fertilizers really do come down to many growers, to a cost benefit decision. You know, they've long been linked to food security, improved yields, decreased food prices, availability of products to underserved communities, ability to farm poorer soils. But really, that's only part of the picture. You know, at what cost are we trying to seek these specific and often limited or short-term gains? We're seeing fertilizers increasingly linked to waterway pollution, increased emissions, acidification of soil, mineral depletion, and ultimately increased fertility needs of some of our crops in the long term. And one of the things that really doesn't get the due mention that it should here is nitrous oxide emissions, and that is one of the most important links between fertilizer use and climate change. Yes, use of fertilizer has been linked to increased biomass production, which does increase carbon sequestration and so forth. However, for fertilizer production, specifically nitrogen fertilizers, is really energy intensive. And the use of nitrogen fertilizers accounts for over 2.5% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Nitrous oxide is an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas that's considered the most ozone depleting emission and is primarily linked to agriculture. Application of nitrogen fertilizer accounts for over 80% of the nitrous oxide emissions in the US. And by the way, it's been demonstrated that nitrous oxide carries between 250 and 300 times the global warming potential relative to CO2. So this is a really important part of climate change that is being overlooked a little bit here. So just kind of looking at the big picture connection between agriculture and the climate. In total, it's been estimated that between 21 and 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to the food system, including 9 to 14% from on-farm activities, up to 10% from land conversion, and between 5 to 10% from the supply chain itself. And furthermore, and as we'll discuss as we go through the program today, is that the degradation of soils worldwide really does contribute to this problem. It is a self-perpetuating and a self-escalating system, as we'll see. And degraded soils, really what happens is that they have an inhibited ability to sequester carbon. It drives more fertilizer and pesticide use. And what you can see is actually farms that are able to limit their use of fertilizers. Organic farms, for example, are able to sequester up to 14 times more carbon based on some studies. So to just kind of summarize what we've discussed and to put a finer point on things here, pesticide use remains near all-time high levels, and DDT residue specifically, it's been estimated, can be found in virtually every living organism on Earth. Let me say that again. DDT residues are found in every living organism on Earth. That's how pervasive pesticides have become. Fortunately, DDT is not being used anymore, but it hasn't been used in around 30, 40 years, and we're still finding it in every living organism. Pesticide fertilizer use are among the leading greenhouse gas emitters, inhibiting carbon sequestration at the same time. One thing that maybe not everyone is aware of, and we'll discuss here on the next slide, is how CO2 and nitrous oxide emissions are actually leading contributors not only to climate change, but also to a nutrient collapse. So let's get into that. So what we've seen over the last 50 years is vanishing nutrient levels in the food that we're growing. We've seen reliable declines in 6 of 13 nutrients across 43 food groups that were studied in a 2004 study. And this includes a 6% overall reduction in protein and 38 on average % reduction in riboflavin. And again, this is across 43 different food groups. We're talking average levels here. So what is contributing to this? Is it soil overuse, mineral depletion? Well, some can be explained by this, yes. But this doesn't really tell the entire story. Yes, we're growing higher yielding varieties, more tasty varieties instead of more nutritious varieties, ones that produce more biomass. All of that is true, but it really doesn't paint the picture of the entire story here. And so what we're seeing and better understanding now is that carbon dioxide actually acts in a way as junk food to plants. On one hand, it promotes biomass production, but on the other hand, it provides less nutrient density. And what science is showing now is that atmospheric CO2 levels are on the rise, and that is correlated with nutrient density of all of our crops decreasing. So again, the availability of all this CO2, yes, it's helping these plants grow large and grow strong and produce this biomass, but the nutrient uptake, the reason that we eat these vegetables to begin with is, yes, they taste good, but they're also nutritious. But with these increased levels of atmospheric CO2, what we're seeing is decreased nutrient uptake in the crops that we're growing. And this graph here is maybe a little bit hard to understand at first, but what it shows is how fertilization only compounds this problem. This shows a study in raspberries that they followed nutrient levels of, what is that, about 8 or 10 different mineral nutrients following the application of a phosphorus fertilizer. And what they found is that by juicing these crops with phosphorus, the plant actually showed significant reductions in all of the other mineral nutrient categories after over 40 days. So they got the nutrition from phosphorus, but they really didn't continue the uptake of these other nutrients because of the overavailability of phosphorus. So again, rising CO2 levels, decreased crop nutrition. We're trying to make up for that in fertilizers, but that is really a simplistic approach that, as you can see here, is actually compounding that problem, not fixing it. So where do we go? What's to be done, right? Can the entire world convert to organic agriculture? I manage SCS's organic program. I would love that. I grew up an organic farmer. This would be great. Studies have shown organic to be, well, this question as to whether organic can go it alone to be a legitimate, debate. Organic yields have been shown to be competitive with conventional yields for many crops after a 5-year transition. They've been found to be drought resilient, and they've been found to use less energy and produce up to 40% fewer emissions compared to conventional. But at the same time, we all know there are challenges. Is this practical? Is this feasible? Conversion to organic, according to some studies, has translated to an increase in overall land usage, an increase in deforestation in some cases. And, then there's the incompatibility with other technologies such as hydroponic production, vertical farming, as well as, yes, bioengineering, which, as we all know, is a hotly debated topic, but for better or for worse, is, seemingly a part of our food production future. So let's sit on that for a minute before we move on. Speaking of bioengineering, is this going to be our white knight? Can we engineer our way out of this problem? Genetically engineered foods have been associated with many claimed benefits. Many of these claimed benefits: more nutritious food, better flavor, less water usage, disease resistance, lower cost, better shelf life, reduced use of pesticides. What does the data show? Is all of that true? Well, some maybe, some not quite as much. What we see is that use, for example, of BT engineered crops. These are crops that have been engineered to produce Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural pesticide, we've seen in the short term that this can reduce insecticide applications by 56 million kilograms between 2016 and 2011. So between 2011 and 2016, my apologies. So over 5 years, that's a pretty significant decrease in insecticide applications, to take an isolated example. So great news, right? You know, maybe this is going to come in and save us all. But unfortunately, what we see is that BT resistance can also require farmers to have to revert to using conventional synthetic pesticides anyhow. If their pests are growing resistant to the engineered crops that they're growing, then they have to use whatever means are at their disposal to control them. Also, this resistance doesn't only affect the farmer growing GMO crops, but his neighbors that he shares pests with. Those farmers are then required to spray more pesticides, to use synthetics instead of BT to control their pests. So the overall impact on the climate and the environment really can be hard to quantify. One of the primary applications of GMOs is to produce herbicide resistance crops. That has led to an increase in herbicide use to the tune of 239 million kilograms during this same timeline. So when you're comparing that to the 56 million kilogram reduction in insecticide applications, you're looking at a net global increase of pesticide use of 7% associated with producing GMO crops. And so we're now seeing too, as we're studying these crops and the pests that they have been designed to be resistant to, is that we're seeing the pests themselves, over a third of the populations that have been studied, are becoming resistant to some of these pesticide producing crops, such as BT corn, for example. So what it comes down to is that we've really got to try to break up this cycle, right? We've seen how use of pesticides, how use of fertilizers can impact the climate, impact our ecosystems, decrease our nutrients, and then how that can then become this self-escalating cycle, right? So what it comes down to is getting back to the fundamentals of farming here. How do we break this cycle? Well, looking at the things that we've been doing for centuries, rotating our crops, cover cropping and intercropping to increase diversity, to really break up those cycles of weeds, insects, and plant diseases by replacing a crop that is susceptible to them with another crop that is not. Rotating fallow with 2, 3, 4 crops in the soil lets the soil rebuild. Use of cover cropping reduces weed growth, improves soil organic matter, improves carbon sequestration, acts as a nitrogen fixer, makes nutrients more available to crops, and on and on. Cover cropping is shown to have up to a 10-fold increase in the diversity of predatory insect communities, reducing the need for pesticides in the first place. No-till and shallow and reduced tillage really does help maintain organism levels in the soil to reduce usage of chemical fertilizers, while reduction of pesticide use helps mycorrhizal formation, in the root zone of plants, helps produce beneficial bacteria that help stave off some of these harmful bacteria and harmful plant pathogens. So the real punchline here, is that true integrated pest management is the solution, and that can come in so many different forms. There is no one right way of doing this, right? Farms should not seek fully to eradicate their pests, but to live with them and manage them below economic thresholds. The first line of defense of pests really is a clean and healthy agroecosystem that helps biological processes that really underpin the production of healthy, nutritious, and sustainable crops. So to look at some of these alternative and emerging production systems that we're now seeing that are helping bring agriculture to more urban environments and helping to localize agriculture, these really do carry with them a number of benefits, but also sometimes some roadblocks or challenges. So, are these the future of agriculture? Well, they're a part of it for sure. Looking at conventional greenhouses, it helps localize agriculture, reducing emissions associated with transport. Hydroponic and advanced greenhouses, these are ones that are using very, very limited water, that are using renewable energy to produce them. Higher precision and pest control. So often some of these environments can almost look like a laboratory. There's sterile rooms where you get in gowns and it's like you're in a science lab, but that enables many of these systems to avoid pesticide use altogether. Vertical farming, as well, I think that the benefits are well documented, including eliminating pesticide use altogether in many cases, localizing agriculture, extreme water efficiency. But the one big caveat here is that vertical farming, indoor production, really, as far as its overall carbon footprint, impact on the environment, it really does depend on what kind of grid you're on. So if you're on a coal grid, it's actually better to be growing your crops outdoors, or in fact shipping them from elsewhere, it has been found. According to one study, they actually found that it was more energy efficient and less emissions intensive to grow and ship lettuce from fields in Salinas to New York City than to vertically farm them there on a non-renewable grid. So again, as we convert to renewables, vertical farming really is going to be a critical component of localizing agriculture and reducing overall emissions. So how can we reduce chemical use and meet consumer demand at the same time? Is this all just wishful thinking? It goes against conventional wisdom as peddled by agrochemical companies, which is the use of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers should be central to our commercialized agriculture, or we're due to face certain collapse of our global food systems. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And what we're going to look at here is a handful of studies that have really pitted conventional agriculture against alternative production systems to really try to get down to their viability to feed the world. So there was a 2017 study in France of 950 non-organic farms across over 950 non-organic farms in France, and they reviewed their input use, productivity, and profitability. And what they showed is that 77% of them showed no conflicts between pesticide use and high productivity and profitability. The majority of these farms could reduce their pesticide use by approximately 42% and herbicide use by 60% with absolutely no adverse impact on productivity and profitability. Another study in 2001 compared results from a 4-year experiment looking at IPM operations that are using integrated pest management versus conventional cropping methods. They were looking at commercial scale corn and watermelon fields across the Midwest. And use of integrated pest management enabled up to a 95% reduction in insecticide use versus conventional. They also found that the use of neonicotinoid seed treatments, which we all know neonics are really bad for our pollinator populations, honeybees specifically. Use of these seed treatments did not improve crop yields measurably at all. And in fact, over the course of this study, they saw that the IPM watermelon fields produced 26% better yield versus the conventional fields. On and on. A 2020 study of 1,000 farmers in Southern Asia showed that over 3/4 of them overused pesticides, resulting in a 77% excess expenditure over the economic optimum. So not only are they over applying these materials unnecessarily polluting their fields, their waterways, but they were wasting money, a 77% excess expenditure. We all know how thin of margins our growers operate on here. The greatest overuse was observed where, guess what? Where pesticide sellers were advising the farmers. Sounds familiar. In 2019, an experiment published in HAL Open Science. This one also was out of France, and it actually showed that farmers' decisions around how they use pesticides are more driven by fear of catastrophic crop loss than by actual consequences on average decreased profit loss due to normal pest damage. So again, it goes back to kind of peddling this fear that we're all facing certain collapse. You better use this product because 1 out of every 50 years, maybe you'll experience a catastrophic crop loss. Well, in fact, that's not actually the case. And again, it is more this fear than reality that is driving the decisions of many of our farms. So how do we wrestle with this? How do we move forward? Is there any one system that can just come in and really be our savior? Well, no. The plain answer is no. Desmond Tutu famously said there is only one way to eat an elephant, and that's a bite at a time. You know, really it's going to take a sum of many different efforts here. All of us doing what we can, where we can, to make a difference as producers and to make a difference as consumers. We've reviewed impacts that agriculture can have on the environment, on climate, on human health, and how cleaner food and agriculture systems can address some of these issues. The reality is that resolving the complex issues facing our agriculture sector requires not following just one of these paths, but all of them simultaneously. Again, doing everything we can where we can do it. Cleaner food and agriculture programs provide a framework for reducing emissions, improving soil health, sequestering carbon, and as we've recently demonstrated, maintaining yields in most cases. A study published a year or two ago, this one was funded by the Non-GMO Project actually, looking at food labels, found that customers are more likely to buy products when they see USDA organic. 41% of consumers said they're more likely to buy USDA organic. 36% of consumers says they're more likely to buy non-GMO Project verified. 21% fair trade, 16% certified plant-based, 15% of consumers said that they're more likely to buy a certified gluten-free product. So the data shows that labeling your products, participating in third-party certification programs, one, it does make a difference, and two, it really does help reach your consumers and help drive responsible purchasing choices. So what we'll do is just look at a few of the programs that are available to consumers and that ag producers also should be aware of in helping to connect with these consumers that are aware, of these challenges that we're all faced with. So the pesticide residue-free program is one that is proprietary to SCS. It's the only one of its kind that really guarantees the absence of pesticide residues on certified products. We go on farm, we sample every site, every production site to specifically look for drift of pesticides, use of pesticides, and we put this through a rigorous sampling protocol to ensure that the product that goes to the consumer has absolutely zero pesticide residues on it. This program has been shown to reduce overall pesticide usage by over 75% of participating growers, and reducing the pesticide load to consumers by virtually 100%. So we're, again, not only mitigating for what is used on farm, but prior land use and off-farm risk factors as far as drift and so forth. So participants in this program really do go through a very, very rigorous protocol to ensure that they're delivering a product that is absolutely free of pesticides to their customers. Sustainable agriculture and SCS Sustainably Grown Certified looks really, beyond just the impacts on farm to also the social and economic and ethical impacts of the farming practices to the communities that certified farms are in. And then on farm, really this program looks at soil health, efficient use of water, environmental stewardship, requiring continuous improvement of integrated pest management practices, and then the reduction and the phase out of pesticides that are the most harmful to human health, pollinator health, ecosystem health. So it really is helping a grower that really wants to take their IPM, their integrated pest management program, to the next level to really truly be impactful, as well as to ensure that their practices are promoting social equity and economic equity. The USDA organic program is really built around the core IPM principle of using the least intensive, least toxic means of pest control, and the acceptance of the fact that we're not trying to eradicate, but merely to control pests. Organic takes these principles a few steps further, however, implementing a prohibition on most synthetic agrochemicals and requiring that farming methods must maintain or improve the condition of the operation's natural resources, including the health of their soil and including water quality. Even most of the natural pesticides and fertilizers that are approved for use in organic systems are specific and have narrow restrictions around how they can be used. Just because something is allowed for organic does not mean that it can just be used however a producer might like to use it. Really, us as certifiers are evaluating the need and how these products are being used to ensure that the least intensive product is used as possible. Compared to conventional farms, organic has been demonstrated to have up to an 18% less global warming potential. And this beats out conventional on a per unit basis, even when factoring in occasional decreases in productivity. So even unit per unit, organic has been shown to have less global warming potential compared to non-organic. A 50% less reliance on reactive nitrogen, a 30% higher species diversity, 50% more pollinators versus conventional farms. You're also seeing a greater amount of biological activity, soil stability, better biomass, soil organism diversity. Organic farms have been shown to sequester more carbon from soils than non-organic farms and can reduce pesticide consumer exposure by up to 96%, which is very, very significant. And while USDA Organic maintains prescriptive requirements around what materials and what methods can and cannot be used on farm, it doesn't necessarily look very closely at the outcomes provided that these regulations are followed. So regenerative really takes that one step further and looks at the entire agriculture system and the impacts that it has on the environment and on farming communities. Regenerative is really outcome focused. So we're looking at nutrient cycling. Regenerative practices result in quantifiable soil health improvements. And these practices include using minimal tillage, making sure that you're keeping crop residues on or in the soil, maintaining a root environment with high microbial activity, interplanting, cover cropping, rotation, and integration of livestock as well on farm to reduce the need for off-farm inputs, trying to bring your agricultural system as close to a closed circuit as possible. But it goes beyond that. It also looks at social equity as far as improving freedom of association, farmer representation and organization, fair payments, living wage, working conditions, making sure that farmers, farm workers have long-term commitments from their employers. It also touches down on animal welfare standards as well, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, hunger, and disease. We're looking at grass-fed and pasture-raised animals, that are not being transported great distances, that are being sheltered sustainably. And really, or regenerative agriculture, regenerative organic is compatible with and really builds upon organic production practices to really take it to that next level in a way that really is meaningful to our environment and to our communities. And another program that maybe some of you are less familiar with is one that is, again, proprietary to SCS, and this is our carbon neutral certified. And what this really looks at is the overall footprint of an operation. And this can apply to a business entity, a building, or a product. We now have certified beer, we now have certified milk in the agriculture space to SCS carbon neutral. And so it's really based on an internationally recognized carbon neutrality protocol to ensure that an overall footprint of an operation is, one, fully quantified, but then two, that any emissions that are generated from that system are offset and then over time reduced, and then any reductions that these operations can make in their emissions over time, they can make up the rest of the gap by offsetting basically their carbon emissions. So product certification really looks at a cradle to grave product life cycle assessment based on calculating the greenhouse gas emissions from manufacture to end of life, and then maintaining net zero emissions for these operations through that entire production system. So in summary, we're really, instead of seeing conventional agriculture contribute to the demise of our climate, we're not letting that happen. Instead, we are seeing the demise of conventional agriculture in the US and in Europe and in much of the developed world. And we're seeing that this is not just one solution, but a kaleidoscope of solutions that really are impactful and that producers can pursue and that consumers can find in their stores to really bring activism to the grocery store and to consumer choice. Conventional is on its way out. There's no doubt about that. You know, many non-organic farms are moving away from intensive pesticide and fertilizer use, but there's still a lot of work to be done here at home and most of the developing world, you know, for that matter. So moving to a cleaner food and agriculture system requires incremental change. There is no one size fits all solution. But with making these changes and making informed purchasing decisions, we can do this one decision and one purchase at a time. So I want to thank everybody for attending today. I hope you were able to take away from today's session that really, again, that it's about bucking the trend and that we are well on our way already to envisioning a more sustainable future for our food and agriculture systems. Great, well, thanks again, everybody. We really appreciate you attending today. We'll see you next time.